Thank you very much, and what an amazingly powerful presentation to follow. And I think our conversation really does complement this in terms of how we are going to look at palliative care and paramedicine in Australia and what is our response. And I am today collaborating with my colleague Nigel, and similarly to come at this from two different perspectives. I am not a paramedic, and Nigel is, so I invite him up to tell us about his approach.
We thought, sorry, is that better? This one, that's better. We thought we'd start off with, how do we go to the next slide? Sorry there. I can follow instructions, good. I thought we'd talk a little bit about my background and how my experiences with palliative care. There's a bunch of images on the slide here, and those from Queensland should know these quite well. Other people maybe not so I'll go through them briefly. The one on the left, some paramedics from Hervey Bay took a lady who was a palliative patient by the beach on her way home. It was a dying wish to see the ocean for one last time. That went around the world. Feel-good story. The fellow on the bottom picture there on the right-hand side, another patient who was a palliative patient near the end of his life. He really desired a caramel sundae, and the paramedics went out of their way to get him one of those on the way to hospital. He died 2 days later, but he was happy as Larry when he got that caramel sundae. And those sorts of events led to the creation of the Wish Ambulance in Queensland, which is supporting those end-of-life experiences for people. But unfortunately, in my experience, they're the rarities. They're the rarities that we treasure, but our everyday experience might be slightly different. And I guess mine is seen through the literature that's come out in the last 5 years. These moments I've had with some of my patients, but generally, on average, I've found paramedics to be uncomfortable and not confident in palliative care or end-of-life care. Found that most of the types of cases we go to are respiratory, followed by pain, and then the deceased. They're the big top three, and they've certainly come out in the literature from Victoria last year. And also in the literature it talks about palliative care that goes well with paramedics and palliative care that's done poorly. And I've seen a lot of poor palliative care, as our last group, last presenters sort of touched on. And that impacts the family, the friends, the caregivers, the paramedic, and the patient. And I think this is why some ambulance services around the world have looked at it, is this a specialty role for paramedics? And I firmly believe it isn't. I firmly believe it's a foundational skill and understanding we should have, just as the same as we give good cardiac care. And I'll just hand back over to Kylie, who will talk a little bit about palliative and end-of-life care.
And I guess that's really where our alliance forms, because as the National Project Manager for the Palliative Care Curriculum for Undergraduates, or PCC for you, our main aim is to build the capacity and the confidence for all of the health workforce to provide care to palliative patients. And really our underpinning framework is that palliative care is everybody's business. And just as a sort of setting the scenes and to remind people in the room around what is palliative care, we're really talking about that approach that improves quality of life for individuals and their families whilst they're facing life-limiting illnesses through the relief of suffering, and that's through identification, impeccable assessment, which I know paramedics are amazing at, and also treatment of pain and other problems in a holistic way, not just their physical needs. Oh, I went backwards. I can't follow directions. So when we're talking about the National Palliative Care Strategy in Australia, really provides that overarching vision for palliative care, and it requires that the people affected by life-limiting illnesses get the care they need to live well for as long as possible. And it reinforces that everyone has a role to play in palliative care. And one of the strategies to achieve that is through capacity and capability building, and that is that the knowledge and practice of palliative care is embedded in all care settings. So key to that, we know that our position is essentially that paramedics, as integral members of the healthcare team, have a role to play in the provision of palliative care. And whilst there are challenges, there are also opportunities that we can take from this for the profession. And we really want today for you to consider that. How do you best engage with this activity and the practice of palliative care now and into the future? Oh, I've gone backwards again. So why are we talking about this now? We've talked about the ageing and the growing population. We know that. Significantly, someone yesterday asked about the number of centenarians, and we're looking at 40,000 centenarians in 2066 compared to just under 5,000 now. So significantly older population. And some of the work by your WA colleagues that was published in 2015 looked at the perceptions of paramedics around palliative care and really highlighted that they thought it was for cancer patients and those really in that acute period at the end of life. And whilst that's an important stage, we know that these ageing populations really do lead to a change in how the people that you're going to see in the future. They're going to have more chronic conditions, and whilst cancer will become a chronic condition, you'll have an increased number of people with dementia and degenerative disorders. And these people are going to be cared for in their own homes and residential environments, and quite often the paramedics are going to be there for the ones that are at the coalface. And the number of people is just astronomical. So in 2017, approximately 120,000 people with palliative needs. That's going to double in the next 50 years.
Thank you. So these three words on the slide here: distress, burnout, and poor patient outcomes. David Long is a recently minted PhD graduate from Queensland University of Technology, and in his thesis on community paramedicine, he touched on palliative care patients. And he was talking about the difference in patients that we normally go to. So the traditional patient, we have a very brief encounter, it's over quickly, we're there to sustain life, we're there to treat the acute illness. Whereas with the palliative care patient, you're going to go back and you're going to see those people time and time again over their trajectory of their last year of illness. You're going to form a relationship with them, and you're going to get to know them. And there's a quote in his thesis that says, no matter what fences we put up, we get to know them. And that means that the burden those people carry with the effect of that illness upon that person becomes more centred into their psyche. And I guess that's what it's about. When we deliver, or we're part of a system that's delivering poor palliative care, we will carry it home, we'll carry that trauma home, as our last speaker spoke about. And at the moment we have a fractured healthcare system. We have a system that probably our rural paramedics carry more of a burden for, because there's less resources for them to engage with in the country and to be part of. I've worked in Metro for about 5 years, and I worked in country Australia for about 15 years with my paramedicine. And I've worked in places where there's 24/7 in-home palliative care. More often that was in a metro centre than a rural centre. More often in my rural environment, I've worked in a place where there's 5 to 8 care and nothing after hours. The paramedic was it after hours. I've worked in other places where the palliative care is brokered out to community nurses and GPs, and this can be a very ad hoc arrangement, so no real set standard there. And I've also met patients that are on a waiting list for palliative care and they die before they get the palliative care because there are no resources. Now I think in this day and age that's quite shameful in Australia. All these problems lead to increased emergency department presentations. They lead to increased hospitalisations, which are avoidable, not necessary, and sometimes disastrous for those patients. In those patients that fall through the gaps of palliative care, there's poor advanced healthcare planning. It means we don't know the patient's wishes. There's no documentation of the ceiling of care. So when do we stop? When does the patient wish us to stop? What do they want in their last in their last leg of life? It's a two-way street though. Paramedics are often or report in the literature, they're under-skilled, under-educated for that environment. And then they're also sometimes thrust into family chaos, where people who have not been involved in the care are turning up in the last few days of that person's life. That person that turns up may have been a traditional decision maker within the family, wield a lot of power within that family, and they're making decisions based on their anxiety and their distress at what they're seeing. They haven't been involved in the care. And that can derail quality palliative care and lead to poor outcomes for everyone involved, the patient, the family, the paramedic, the people in the hospital system. So that's what we're aiming to avoid.
So I guess what are we actually seeing then in the system of healthcare that we're working in and that's impacting on paramedics in palliative care? And currently there are no national guidelines or standards that support this activity. And this is therefore, and also paramedics are not present within palliative care service delivery frameworks and key policy documents. And as a consequence, then we're seeing for the state planning documents, these are then varying in approach and scope. And whilst there have been some fantastic local initiatives that are responding to legitimate needs, I guess the question really has to be asked, is this the best way forward for paramedicine to be reactive and acting in a way that potentially could be seen as ad hoc? And realistically, how can paramedicine be strategic in approaching palliative care of the future? And we're proposing that it can be done. So there are examples where paramedicine has been effectively embedded in planning and workforce frameworks in Canada and the UK. In Canada, there's a great example of a palliative care community activity which led to 55% hospital avoidance. And there's a UK colleague here in the audience somewhere who's spoken to me about the collaboration with the Macmillan service and the development of Macmillan ambulance services to provide an after-hours service across a number of regions for their cancer patients quite collaboratively. And also some in the UK, a goal to have a nationally available documentation for advanced care planning, which would just be fantastic, and the paramedics there have been integral to that decision making. So there's certainly some lessons to be learned from international colleagues. And workforce development is also another key strategy to enhance palliative care provision. The palliative care workforce requires adequate preparation and ongoing support, and the national palliative care projects have been supported by the Australian Government through PEPA and PCC for You to help develop some of these capabilities. And I just wanted to highlight some of the work that's being done in New South Wales with the PEPA program and a collaboration with New South Wales a local health district. And that gave an opportunity for 30 paramedics in regional New South Wales to undertake placements, and this was really well received. And I think key to that was the collaborating with the specialist palliative care CNC and the government support, and really demonstrates the power of partnering. You don't have to do this alone, and also the use of specialist clinicians. It is recommended also that academic programs look to establish national palliative care graduate capabilities, such as PCC for You capabilities, which identify the expectations of the graduates. And these can be implemented in universities and adapted based on the scope of practice and the discipline-specific requirements of paramedicine. Currently, only half of paramedic programs in Australia actually are able to report implementation of palliative care. So how do we change that and really understand the role and scope which may actually assist with academics embedding this? And I think paramedicine is really at the forefront and needs to lead this conversation.
So Kylie set us a challenge a little while ago, and in collaboration with my old boss, Bill Lord. And for me, I took the approach of looking at the capabilities described in the PCC for You curriculum. I looked at the literature, and these aims here are basically taken from the literature in the last 5 years about what paramedicine reported it wanted to do. So I won't go through those, but the idea was these aims aligned with the capabilities in the curriculum, or could be enact the capabilities in the curriculum. So we looked at our curriculum over 3 years. We weren't going to introduce a new course, but we looked at all the courses in our program. This is just some of them. This is just a sample from year 1 to year 3 about what pops up in the PCC for You curricula. And we embed it along the way. We extend each course a little bit to touch on palliative care. So everything from professional practice, reflective practice, Indigenous perspectives on death and dying, which we've just seen the importance of that in our previous presentation, patient-centred care, models of care, disease trajectory, etc., and ending up in the capstone course in year 3 with some high-fidelity simulation cases around palliative care. So we've changed our curriculum in most of our courses to embed those aspects, and we've started that this year. But behind that, we also teach transferable skills, and I think this is a really important part we neglect in curricula. It's talking about those skills that will enable or empower someone to take their knowledge and change the world around them. So being collaboration ready, being able to work with other professions, knowing how to communicate between disciplines, having a patient-centred philosophy of care and understanding evidence, understanding the scientific basis for healthcare evidence, and having leadership qualities. So we train leadership from day 1 in our program, and we have a leadership course in our 3rd year, and it's about leadership, followership, upwardly challenging and changing the system around you to effect better goal acquisition. So we use the idea of transferable skills, declarative knowledge and simulation to enact the advancing of palliative care knowledge within our graduates. So that's how we envisage doing it at our university. We've got about a minute left. What I'm wondering, if anyone's got a response to any of these 3 questions here. So what does our national response as paramedic services look like so we can avoid the headwinds that some of our paramedics may feel heading into a palliative care case, that dread, oh dear, here we go again, to absolutely smooth, plain sailing, which effects a good outcome in a patient. And that good outcome may be to enable a nice and beautiful death. How do we support our local organisations, and what smooths our path and builds confidence and capacity in our workforce? I'd be interested to hear some comments from anyone in the audience.